Guys, I need to give you an update, and honestly, this one might be even more important than my last video, because we are now looking at the possibility of a second flood. Let that sink in for a second. We are still dealing with the aftermath of the first catastrophe. More than 1,300 people are still missing. And now there are signs that the river that caused all of this might not be finished yet. So stay with me, because I'm going to walk you through everything we know right now, what has changed since yesterday, and why officials are worried about round two. Let's start with where things stand. We have more than 1,300 people missing after what I am now confident calling a glacier collapse, not an earthquake, not simply a landslide in the traditional sense, but a genuine mountain and glacier collapse that triggered a catastrophic flash flood. Over 165 people are confirmed lost right now, and I have to be honest with you, with an event of this scale, that number is almost certainly going to climb. Search and rescue teams are still out there right now, working through destroyed infrastructure, and the destroyed infrastructure is part of the problem, because it is actively hampering the search for more than 300 foreigners who were in the region when this happened. There were a lot of tourists in that area, a lot of pilgrims too, and that is part of what makes this so devastating. Now here is the update that changes everything, and it is the reason I titled this video the way I did. We now have reports suggesting that the river is still blocked. Not was blocked, still blocked, which means the water that caused the initial wall of destruction might not have been the full release. There could be more coming. I want to walk you through how we got to this point, because the story of what actually happened up in those mountains has been shifting almost by the hour, and I think understanding the full sequence is the only way to understand why a second flood is even on the table. So rewind with me for a second. When this first broke, the immediate assumption, and honestly my own assumption in my first video, was that an earthquake triggered a landslide, and that landslide triggered the flood. That felt like the obvious explanation because seismic stations picked up a signal, and early reporting treated that signal as a magnitude 4.4 earthquake near the Nepal-China border. Under that theory, the shaking from the quake destabilized an already fragile slope, and that is what sent the mountain down into the valley. It's a clean story. It fits a lot of disasters we've seen before, but it turns out that is not what happened here, and the correction is honestly one of the more remarkable parts of this whole event. The United States Geological Survey went back through the seismic data, and they concluded that no earthquake occurred at all. What their instruments picked up was not the ground rupturing underground the way it does in a tectonic earthquake. What they picked up was the mountain collapsing. The sheer mass of ice and rock coming down the slope generated a seismic signal so large that it was initially mistaken for an actual earthquake. And once the full picture came into focus, that signal was upgraded from a magnitude 4.4 to a magnitude 5.2. Think about the scale of that for a second. An avalanche of ice and rock moving down a mountainside produced enough force to register as a 5.2 magnitude seismic event. That is not a small slide. That is an enormous release of energy, and it completely flips the sequence of events. Instead of earthquake first and then collapse, it was collapse first. And the collapse itself is what shook the ground. So if it wasn't an earthquake that caused the collapse, what did? This is where I want to bring in what we're hearing from Professor Rian Bhakta-Kayastha, who heads the Department of Environmental Science at Kathmandu University. His assessment, based on the evidence coming in, is that this was primarily caused by a massive ice avalanche breaking off a nearby glacier. He places that glacier on the Nepal side of the border region within the broader Lang area, though I want to be careful here because other preliminary satellite analysis places the actual collapse zone right along the Nepal-China border itself. So the precise political side of where this began is still being refined. And I think that detail matters less right now than the physical reality of what came down. And before I go further, I do want to address something directly because I got a wave of comments on my last video accusing me of being some kind of agent for one side or another simply because I mentioned the Chinese side of the border. I am not doing that. I am reporting on a natural disaster that happened to occur on a border that runs through some of the most extreme terrain on the planet. That's it. There is no angle here. This is a shared tragedy that struck communities on both sides of that line, and I think it deserves to be treated that way. Now, satellite imagery has given us a much clearer picture of where this began. Scientists have located the origin point roughly 20 kilometers, about 12 miles, northeast of the Raswagati border crossing between Nepal and China. This is genuinely high Himalayan terrain, sitting above the drainage that feeds into what's been called the Lehenda, or Lendakola, which then flows down into the Potakoshi and eventually into the larger Trishuli river system. So we're not just talking about one small stream here, we're talking about a chain of rivers that carried this disaster a long way downstream. The preliminary imagery shows an enormous ice and rock avalanche breaking loose at extreme elevation, somewhere around 5,200 meters, which is close to 17,000 feet, and then falling more than 1,200 meters, nearly 4,000 feet, straight down into the valley below. I want you to actually picture that vertical drop because it's extraordinary. Almost 4,000 vertical feet of ice and rock, accelerating the entire way down. A lot of people have compared this to the Blatten disaster in Switzerland, and I understand why, because that was also a mountain and glacier collapse that buried a village. But there's a key difference here. In Switzerland, that mass came down and essentially stopped where it landed, burying Blatten in place. What we're looking at in Nepal is something that didn't just stop. It fragmented as it fell, it pulverized rock on the way down, it picked up loose sediment, it threw air outward with enough force to create the shockwave effects you can see in a lot of the footage circulating online. And then, critically, once that moving mass entered a confined river valley, it didn't just settle. It started picking up water and additional debris as it continued moving. Now here's the part that has genuinely puzzled scientists, and it's the part I think matters most for understanding why a second flood is even a possibility. A glacier collapse on its own, even one this size, does not fully explain the sheer volume of floodwater that came roaring down these valleys. That's the piece that didn't add up initially. Because normally when we talk about a flood this catastrophic coming out of the mountains, we're talking about heavy monsoon rainfall combining with unstable terrain. That is not what happened here. It was a sunny day. There was no extreme rainfall event over the source area capable of explaining a flood of this scale. So where did all that water come from? Scientists initially assumed there had to be a glacial lake sitting upstream, one of those slowly filling bodies of water that eventually bursts through its natural dam. But when researchers pulled satellite imagery from before and after the event, they didn't find a lake. No obvious large body of water sitting up there waiting to be released. So that ruled out the simplest explanation, and it opened up a genuine mystery because the flood's water volume was enormous and it had to be coming from somewhere. One piece of the explanation involves something called crevasses, the deep fractures you often see running through a heavily stressed glacier. Professor Kayasta has pointed to these as part of the puzzle. When a glacier is fractured like this, meltwater at the surface can work its way down into those cracks, and it can accumulate in hidden drainage pathways inside and beneath the ice. Pathways you would never see just by looking at the surface. So if a large section of that glacier suddenly fails, all of that trapped water gets released at once, right along with the ice, rock, and sediment. That is likely part of what happened here. But scientists are clear that this may only be part of the story, not the whole explanation. The bigger piece appears to be what happened once that avalanche entered the river valley itself. When a mass of ice and rock that large slams into a narrow mountain river, it can temporarily block the river's flow. And here's the thing, the water upstream doesn't stop arriving just because the channel is blocked. It keeps coming, and now it has nowhere to go. So instead of a slow-building glacial lake that had been sitting there for months, what likely formed was a sudden, temporary natural dam, created in an instant by the debris of the collapse itself. And behind that debris dam, water began to pool and rise, and by all indications, nobody downstream had any idea it was happening. From there are really only two ways that kind of situation resolves. Either the water eventually rises high enough to overtop the debris, or the debris dam itself gives way all at once under the pressure. Based on everything coming out of Nepal right now, the working explanation from Nepalese hydrologists is that the second scenario is what happened. The dam failed catastrophically and released everything that had been building up behind it in a single violent surge. Satellite information obtained through Chinese authorities reportedly showed a blockage roughly 20 kilometers upstream of the area near the border bridge, consistent with a temporary lake having formed there before it gave way. And this is where things get genuinely strange, and honestly a little unsettling. Professor Kayasta has said that when researchers examined Planet Labs' satellite imagery, they could clearly see the enormous ice and rock avalanche itself. But they did not see a large lake or an obvious blockage sitting there in the aftermath. So we're back to the same core question. Where exactly did the water come from, and where did it go? That doesn't necessarily mean a temporary lake never existed. These debris dams can form and fail extremely quickly, fast enough that a satellite pass before the event and another pass after the event can completely miss the window where the lake actually existed. Investigators may genuinely be trying to reconstruct something that only existed for a very short, very violent period of time. And that timing detail matters a lot, because downstream measurements tell us that an enormous amount of material and water arrived all at once. For that much water to be released in a single surge, the storage lake behind that temporary dam must have been massive, even if it only existed briefly. Video that circulated on social media shows the river reportedly rising as much as 9 meters, about 30 feet, in approximately 30 minutes. Guys, that is not a normal flood rise. That is a wall of water arriving with almost no warning. Meteorologists and disaster specialists who have looked at this have compared it to an inland tsunami, a high-energy surge being forced through narrow Himalayan valleys with nowhere to spread out sideways. And you can see exactly what that confinement does in the footage. The valley walls just funnel the entire mass downstream with nowhere for the energy to dissipate. It's also worth being clear that this wasn't clean floodwater moving through these towns. It was loaded with rock, sediment, mud, chunks of ice, uprooted trees, and structural debris. That difference matters enormously because plain water moving through a village, even a fast-moving flood, tends to flow around and through structures. A debris-laden surge like this one behaves completely differently. It hits almost like moving concrete. That's why you see vehicles disappearing underneath the flow in some of this footage. That's why entire ground floors, and in some cases second and third floors, were buried. Some of these buildings weren't just flooded, they were struck by material that behaved less like a river and more like the side of a mountain moving horizontally through the valley at speed. I also want to talk about the people caught in the middle of this, because some of the footage that's circulating is genuinely hard to watch. You can see people filming with their phones as the flood approaches, and to their credit, a lot of them are screaming warnings telling others to get away, get away. But you can also see people who stayed in place far too long, still filming as the water and debris closed in. I understand the instinct. When something this massive and strange is unfolding in front of you, part of you doesn't quite believe it's real until it's almost too late. There's footage of one person running for their life with their phone still recording, and watching it, you feel like you're running right alongside them. It is genuinely terrifying footage, and it drives home just how little warning these communities had, because that's really the core tragedy underneath all of this. There was no storm to watch approaching. There was no darkening sky, no thunder building in the distance, none of the usual signals that tell mountain communities a flood might be coming. The danger originated high in the mountains, miles from where people actually lived, and by the time the river itself gave any visible sign that something had happened upstream, the flood wave was already racing toward the towns below. Now, since my last video, there's an additional detail that's come out through a separate interview, and I want to be careful presenting this one, because the information itself may be changing by the hour, and it hasn't been independently verified through instruments. Professor Kayasta said that several hours before that particular interview, contacts on the Chinese side of the border told him there was still approximately 7 meters, around 23 feet, of water associated with an upstream blockage. I want to stress that was a secondhand report passed along through contacts, not a live instrument reading that anyone has been able to independently confirm right now. So we need to treat it with appropriate caution. But it is exactly why authorities remain seriously concerned about the possibility of additional releases of water, and it's exactly why I titled this video the way I did. Think about what that means physically. When an event this large happens, the upstream valley does not simply return to a stable state the moment the first flood wave passes. There can be additional debris dams forming in places nobody has eyes on. Pieces of ice can continue breaking off and collapsing. Loose rock that was destabilized by the original event can continue shifting and sliding. Other channels in that drainage system can become blocked in spots that are, again, completely invisible to anyone downstream. So even though the first wave has already caused catastrophic damage, the danger doesn't necessarily end just because that first wave has passed through. If there genuinely is still a meaningful volume of water pooled behind blocked debris upstream, and that blockage fails the way the first one apparently did, communities downstream could be facing a second surge with very little additional warning. I sincerely hope that area is being actively monitored right now, because for the rescue teams working down in these valleys, this uncertainty adds an entirely new layer of danger to work no one already believed could get more dangerous. So let's step back and talk about the bigger question, the one that's now on every scientist's desk, since USGS effectively removed the earthquake from this sequence. If it wasn't an earthquake that triggered this, why did the glacier and the mountain slope fail on their own, without any rainfall to push things over the edge? One possibility being actively investigated is unusually high temperatures. Professor Kayasta specifically discussed very warm conditions and increased ice melt in the region as a contributing factor. The mechanism here makes physical sense. When meltwater seeps into those crevasses I mentioned earlier, it doesn't just sit there. It can work its way down and effectively lubricate the base of the glacier, weakening the connection between the ice and the rock beneath it. On top of that, rising temperatures can destabilize the frozen rock surrounding these high-altitude glaciers, rock that has essentially been held in place by ice and cold for a very long time. But I want to be really careful here, because there's an important distinction scientists are making, and I think it's worth respecting. They have not yet demonstrated the precise trigger for this specific collapse. It would be premature and honestly irresponsible to flatly say something like climate change definitely caused this particular disaster. What we can say with confidence is that the broader Himalayan region is warming rapidly, that glaciers across this range are thinning and retreating, and that scientists are increasingly concerned about what they call cascading hazards, chain reactions involving ice, rock, and water that feed into each other in ways that are hard to predict. This exact river system already gave the region a warning last year, when the same Lehenda-Kola drainage experienced a serious glacial flood. That happened only about 14 months before this current disaster, and there's a real possibility that memory saved lives this time because people in the area were at least somewhat aware that something like this could happen again when they heard the rumble building. But I want to be precise about what changed between that earlier event and this one, because the mechanism appears genuinely different. The previous flood in this drainage was associated with a glacial lake slowly filling and eventually bursting through, the more classic glacial lake outburst pattern that this region has seen before. What we're looking at this time does not appear to be that. This wasn't a lake that had been quietly filling for weeks or months until it finally gave way. All the evidence currently points towards something much more sudden, an enormous physical collapse of glacier ice and rock, beginning high above the river and crashing down with enough force to register as a magnitude 5.2 seismic event in its own right. That collapsing mass is what set off the entire chain reaction, the temporary damming of the river, the sudden catastrophic release, the debris-laden surge tearing through the valleys below. So where does that leave us right now in this moment? We have a confirmed death toll of at least 165, a number that is very likely to rise given the scale of what happened. We have more than 1,300 people still missing, including over 300 foreigners who were traveling through or working in the region. We have rescue operations still actively underway, made more difficult by the destruction of critical infrastructure that would normally support that kind of search effort. We have a scientific consensus that has already shifted once, from an earthquake-triggered landslide to a glacier collapse that itself produced the seismic signature initially mistaken for an earthquake. We have an unresolved mystery about exactly how much water was involved and precisely how it was stored and released, a mystery that even satellite imagery hasn't fully answered. And now, layered on top of all of that, we have unconfirmed but credible second-hand reports suggesting that a meaningful amount of water may still be pooled behind blockages upstream, water that has not yet been released, water that could come down as a second surge with the same lack of warning that made the first one so devastating. I want to leave you with this. Events like this are genuinely difficult to interpret in real time, and I think that's obvious just from how much the official explanation has already shifted in the span of a day or two. What looked straightforward at first, an earthquake causing a landslide, causing a flood, turned out to be something far more complex once better seismic and satellite data came in. That's not a failure of the scientists working on this. That's just how these investigations actually work, especially in terrain this remote and this extreme. New information keeps arriving, and the picture keeps sharpening, sometimes in ways that completely reverse the initial story. So I'd encourage you to hold on to that same patience as we wait for more concrete confirmation about this potential second flood. Treat the 7-meter figure as a warning sign worth taking seriously, not as a confirmed fact, because right now it genuinely is somewhere in between. Let me also address something I've been getting asked a lot in the comments, which is why this is being described so many different ways across different videos and different news outlets. You've probably seen this event called a landslide in one headline, an earthquake in another, a glacier collapse somewhere else, and a flash flood in a fourth. Honestly, all of those words are touching some part of the truth. And that's part of what makes this such a difficult event to summarize in a single sentence. It began as an ice and rock avalanche breaking off a glacier at extreme altitude. That avalanche behaved, in physical terms, like a landslide as it thundered down the mountainside, fragmenting and picking up material along the way. The sheer force of that collapse generated a seismic signal strong enough that it was initially mistaken for an actual earthquake, before USGS corrected the record. And then, once that mass entered the river system, it produced a flash flood, and arguably the most destructive part of this entire disaster in terms of loss of life and infrastructure. So in a strange way, every one of those labels is describing a different chapter of the same event, rather than competing explanations for it. I think that's worth understanding, because it explains why the story keeps sounding like it's changing when really it's just being described from different angles as new information comes in. I also want to spend a moment on the human geography of this disaster, because I think it's easy to talk about seismic magnitudes and satellite imagery and lose sight of who was actually in the path of this thing. This is an area that sees a real mix of local residents, workers, and travelers passing through at any given time. There are hydropower projects under construction in these valleys. There are trekking and pilgrimage routes that run close to these rivers. And there are small towns and villages that have existed along these waterways for generations, built around the very rivers that turned against them in a matter of minutes. When we talk about more than 300 foreigners among the missing, we're talking about people who had no reason to expect that a mountain nearly 20 kilometers away, one they likely never saw and never thought about, would determine whether they made it home. That's part of what makes an event like this so disorienting for the people caught in it. The danger wasn't visible until it was already arriving. I keep coming back to that phrase, inland tsunami, because I think it's the most honest way to describe what people actually experienced on the ground. A tsunami, in the ocean sense, is what happens when an enormous, sudden displacement of water gets funneled toward a coastline with nothing to slow it down. What happened here is strikingly similar in principle, just swapping the open ocean for a narrow mountain valley. A massive, sudden release of water, sediment, ice, and rock funneled downstream through steep valley walls that gave it nowhere to spread out and lose energy. That confinement is exactly why the destruction was concentrated the way it was, and exactly why structures that might have survived a slower, more typical flood were overwhelmed almost instantly by something moving with the density and force of debris-laden material rather than plain water. It's also worth pausing on just how unusual it is for scientists to revise a seismic classification this significantly from an earthquake down to a landslide-generated signal of the same rough magnitude. That doesn't happen very often, and when it does, it usually reflects just how much more complex, remote, high-altitude events like this one can be compared to a straightforward tectonic earthquake in a well-monitored region. Out here, in terrain this extreme, seismic stations are often sparse, satellite coverage isn't constant, and ground truth information can take hours or even days to reach investigators. That's part of why the story shifted so much between my first video and this one, and it's honestly part of why I expect it to keep shifting a little more as additional data comes in over the next few days. I also want to touch on something Professor Kayasta's comments highlighted, which is how quickly conditions in that upstream terrain can continue to change even after the initial event has passed. A glacier that has just partially collapsed is not a stable structure. The remaining ice is under new stress, freshly exposed rock faces are sitting there without the support they had before, and any additional warming, even a normal daytime temperature swing at that altitude, could be enough to trigger smaller follow-on collapses in the same general area. None of that guarantees a second major event. But it does mean the upstream zone has to be treated as an active hazard site right now, not a scene that has already played out and finished. That's really the heart of why this second flood threat matters so much and why I wanted to get this update out as quickly as I could. If the reports of roughly 7 meters of water still pooled behind a blockage upstream turn out to be accurate, and if that blockage fails the way the first one apparently did, the exact same dynamic could repeat itself. A sudden surge, minimal warning, and a debris-laden wall of water moving through valleys that are already devastated, and where recovery and rescue operations are actively underway. That's an incredibly dangerous combination, because it would mean rescue teams working in the debris right now could themselves be caught in a second wave while trying to help the survivors of the first one. I don't say that to cause panic. I say it because I think the people watching this deserve an honest picture of what's actually being discussed by the scientists and disaster officials tracking this in real time, rather than a version that's been smoothed over to sound more settled than it actually is. Right now, this is still an active, evolving situation. The scientific community hasn't finished reconstructing exactly how much water was involved, where it was stored, or whether more of it remains upstream. Authorities on both sides of the border are clearly taking the possibility of an additional release seriously enough to keep monitoring the area, and that alone tells you this isn't a theoretical concern being raised for the sake of caution. It's a live possibility being weighed against real, ongoing rescue and recovery work. So here's where I'll leave things for now. We have a confirmed death toll of at least 165, with more than 300 people still missing, over 300 of them foreign nationals who were in the region when this happened. We have a scientific explanation that has already been revised once, from an earthquake-triggered landslide to a glacier collapse that generated its own seismic signature. We have a genuine, unresolved mystery about the true source and volume of the floodwater, one that even before and after satellite imagery hasn't fully answered. And now we have a credible but unverified report of roughly 7 meters of water still sitting behind an upstream blockage, raising real concern about a possible second surge. I'll keep tracking this story as more comes in, because I think it deserves that kind of continued attention, both for the people still missing and for the rescue teams who are still out there working in conditions that could shift again without much notice. If new satellite passes come back showing that blockage clearly, or if officials issue any kind of formal warning about a second release, I will be back here with an update as fast as I can put one together. Until then, please be careful about which sources you're trusting on this, especially anyone online who is already naming a specific glacier or a specific cause with total certainty. As of right now, the scientists working this event haven't reached that level of certainty themselves, and I think that honesty is worth more than a confident-sounding guess. Stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next update.